Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we are not just looking at a few isolated historical facts, we are undertaking a massive navigational challenge.
We really are.
We are strapping in for a high-speed yet detailed tour through a period of monumental, chaotic upheaval across the entire Islamic world, guided by one of the greatest political philosophers and historians of all time, Ibn-e-Khaldun.
Exactly. Khaldun's Kitab al-Ibar is a foundational work of world history, and we are diving deep into the monumental fourth volume, specifically parts V and VI, which map out the 3 centuries following the relative centralization of the early Abbasid Caliphate.
And we're talking, what, roughly the 8th through the 11th centuries CE?
That's the period, a time when that seemingly unified empire it fractured into countless pieces.
And the sheer geographical scope we have to track simultaneously is staggering. I mean, imagine trying to follow 3 separate massive sporting events all happening at once across an ocean.
That's a great way to put it.
We're tracking the decay of the central authority of the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad, dealing with internal revolts and external military threats. At the same time, we have to follow the desperate, structured resistance of the surviving Umayyads out in Spain and Andalusia.
Right. And crucially, we have to track the revolutionary ideological explosion of the Ubaydiyah, the group history came to know as the Fatimids, who were rising to caliphal status across North Africa.
It's not just fragmentation, it's a total geopolitical realignment.
It really is. This is the era where ideological battles immediately translated into territorial wars, where a claim of divine lineage meant nothing unless you had a massive loyal army to enforce it. Military might become the ultimate currency of political legitimacy, replacing, tradition and theological claims.
So for you, the listener, our mission is to cut through the density of Khaldun's material and extract the crucial connections. We're focusing on 3 core themes.
Number 1, how deeply ideological divides drove conflict across vast distances.
2,
the specific mechanics of territorial conquest and state building by these new regional powers.
and finally, how non-Arab military powers, Berbers, Persians, and especially Turkomans, permanently took the reins of history from the old guard.
That's the big picture.
That's a deep bench of history to cover, so let's unpack this, starting right at the foundational ideological cracks. These cracks, the sources make clear, stem primarily from the descendants of Ali bin Abi Talib, the 4th caliph, which Khaldun broadly groups under the term Alawiyah.
The Alawite state, yeah. And what's immediately fascinating here is that the political opposition to the Abbasids, which was primarily what the Alawites represented, was inextricably linked to and often fueled by theological disputes over succession and belief. It wasn't a unified political front.
Not at all.
Ibn Khaldun points out 2 highly influential factions among the descendants of Ali, the Zaydiyah and the Caysaniya sects.
So tell us, what was the practical difference between these 2 factions beyond simply both tracing their lineage back to Ali? Why did their theological views lead to different political outcomes?
That's a great question, because the distinction is vital to understanding the revolutionary dynamic of the period. The Zaydiyah, named after Zayd ibn Ali, often held a more pragmatic, active view of the imamate.
More hands-on, you mean?
Exactly. They believed that the imam had to be a descendant of Ali and Fatima, yes, but crucially, he had to actively rise up and assert his rule, using force if necessary. This doctrine often translated into specific, localized, and sometimes successful revolts against the ruling powers.
Which explains why they actually established states, like later in Yemen.
Precisely. So the Zaydiyah were the activists constantly willing to challenge the status quo through direct action.
Okay, so what about the Caysaniya? What was their approach?
The Caysaniya, linked initially to Kaysan, a follower of Muhammad ibn al-Hanafiyyah, who was Ali's son by a different wife, they often had more mystical or messianic interpretations of the imam.
So less about direct revolution, more about waiting for a sign.
In a way, yes. Their political involvement was frequently focused on belief in a Mahdi, a divinely guided figure who would eventually appear to restore justice. So while their ideology could inspire revolutionary fervor, their immediate political action was often less direct than the Zaydiyah's, focusing on the hidden imam or a future appearance.
So it wasn't just who should rule, but how and when they had the right to rule, and that dictated their revolutionary success.
And this deep internal disagreement among the Alawites constantly put them at odds with the ruling Abbasids, who saw any claimant from Ali's house as a potential threat.
We see this danger vividly in the records regarding the revolt of Hussein bin Ali.
The Chronicles detail this specific incident where Hussein bin Ali rose up against the Abbasid Caliphate. And you see the heavy cost of these challenges. With his eventual defeat and demise near Mecca, this wasn't just a military defeat, it was a psychological and political defeat for the entire Alawite movement.
But why was this specific revolt so critical, even though it failed?
Because it set a crucial precedent. It crystallized the idea that challenging the central authority, even based on a legitimate claim of lineage, could lead to swift, brutal, and public consequences.
A warning shot.
A massive one. Khaldun stresses that these repeated failed rebellions perpetually fueled subsequent Alawite resentment and gave rise to this powerful narrative of oppression, a narrative that was later expertly leveraged by more successful separatist movements.
Like the ones we're about to get to in North Africa.
Exactly. They used this anti-Abbasid sentiment to justify their own territorial ambitions. The failures of the early Alawite revolts gave energy to later, more pragmatic revolutionaries.
Let's follow one of those pragmatic flights now, zooming over to the extreme west. The Maghreb al-Aqsa, modern-day Morocco, where one of these initial Alawite movements actually managed to stick the landing and found a state, the Idrisids.
The story of the Idrisids is just a brilliant case study in geographical opportunism. The founder, Idris bin Abdullah, fled the east following political turmoil and successfully established an independent dynasty in the Maghreb.
Just the fact that he survived the journey is incredible.
And it shows how crucial distance was for survival in this era. The further you were from Baghdad, the slower the Abbasid reaction time, and the easier it was to claim true autonomous sovereignty. It's a fundamental principle of imperial decay.
But the Abbasids' reach was longer than just their military campaigns. Even across the vast distance of the empire, the Caliphate, under Harun al-Rashid, couldn't tolerate a successful rival dynasty based on that politically dangerous Alawite claim.
No, they couldn't. The Chronicles explicitly note the swift, lethal response. Idris was poisoned by an agent of Harun al-Rashid.
Wow. So they reached all the way across North Africa to take him out.
It underscores that centralized power, even in decline, maintains authority through espionage, sabotage, and political murder. It's an early example of imperial intelligence operations maintaining control by decapitating threats far from the front lines.
But they eliminated the founder, yet the nascent Idrisid state didn't immediately dissolve. That's the truly remarkable part.
It is.
So why didn't it collapse? What kept it together?
The text emphasizes a critical transition. The state survived because Idris's successor, his son Muhammad, understood that legitimacy from lineage wasn't enough. He needed sustainable military power.
He needed an army.
A loyal one. He secured the unwavering allegiance of major local Berber tribes, specifically naming the powerful Araba and Sanhaja. Khaldun stresses that this tribal alignment gave the dynasty its military backbone and political structure.
So he shifted the foundation of the state from an abstract religious claim to concrete Asabiyyah.
Group cohesion and loyalty among the fighting forces. That's it.
That's the key connection we need to extract for the listener. Legitimacy is found in lineage, yes, but real sustainable power, the power to tax, govern, and project force, came entirely from Berber tribal alignment and military support.
And that pattern, where military cohesion trumps pure ideological purity, is something we see repeated constantly throughout this entire deep dive, particularly in the West.
Absolutely. And speaking of lasting structured power, if we move slightly south to the Iberian Peninsula, we encounter the Umayyads, the very dynasty the Abbasids had overthrown decades earlier in the east.
And Khaldun highlights their remarkable resilience and success in Andalusia. They didn't just survive, they thrived.
It's astonishing that one branch of the defeated Umayyads managed to establish and maintain what would become a caliphate that lasted for centuries. The sources make special note of the major reigns of rulers like Abu al-Rahman al-Nasir, who died around 961 CE.
Right, and Hisham al-Mutamid. Their resistance wasn't accidental or fragile, it was the product of long-term, sophisticated statecraft. While the East was fracturing and the Abbasid center was being stripped of authority, the Andalusian Umayyads maintained a strong, structured, and highly advanced center of Muslim power in the West.
So they are the counterpoint to the central chaos.
A testament to what centralized power could achieve when isolated from the immediate geopolitical pressures of the Near East.
So we have the Umayyads maintaining order in Spain, and the Idrisids briefly establishing a dynasty through Berber alliances in the Maghreb. But the most dynamically destructive and successful force emerging from the West wasn't either of these.
Not even close.
It was the revolutionary movement that became the Ubaydiyah or the Fatimids in North Africa. This is where the ideological claim, the the Berber military machine and the ambition for universal rule really exploded onto the scene.
This Fatimid revolution is arguably the most important political event of the 10th century, and Khaldun dedicates significant attention to mapping its formation. This was a true revolutionary state, built not by inherited authority, but by pure ideological fervor and military organization.
And the sources name two crucial architects. Abu Abdullah al-Shi is identified as the da'i, the propagandist, the missionary. He did the essential groundwork, right?
Right, but he wasn't the claimed ruler.
So he was the organizer.
Abu Abdullah al-Shi was the political genius. He understood that to challenge established power, he needed a force outside of that establishment. He successfully gathered military power from the Kutama Berbers in Ifriqiya, the central North African coast.
And what was so special about the Kutama?
The brilliance of this recruitment was twofold. First, the Kutama were fierce fighters with powerful Asabiyyah. Second, they were completely loyal to the revolutionary cause because they had been excluded from the political power of the previous Aghlabid dynasty. Khaldun emphasizes that this recruitment base provided the immediate, necessary revolutionary muscle.
And all this preparation was for the arrival of the promised ruler. The sources detail the subsequent arrival of Ubayd Allah al-Mahdi, who claimed direct descent from Fatima, the prophet's daughter, and his establishment as the first Ubaydiyya caliph in AH 296.
And the ideological claim that he was the true, divinely guided leader, the Mahdi was cemented into physical power through those Kutama armies.
But here's where the analysis moves past simple narrative and into Khaldunian political reality. The consolidation of that power was shockingly brutal.
It really was. It demonstrated the cold, ruthless pragmatism necessary for revolutionary survival.
You're referring to the execution of the founders.
Yes. The text notes the surprising and immediate execution of the da'i, Abu Abdullah al-Shi, and his brother just 2 years after the caliphate was declared in AH 298.
Wait, the man who traveled the distance, rallied the army, provided the Kutama base, and made the entire revolution possible, was eliminated almost instantly after installing the ruler.
Gone.
That seems utterly counterintuitive from an outside perspective. If the Kutama were loyal to the da'i, wasn't this immensely risky?
It was a calculated risk, but one Ubayd Allah al-Mahdi clearly deemed essential. It illustrates a ruthless internal power dynamic common in revolutionary states. Khaldun's account makes clear that the new caliph was not going to tolerate anyone, not even his co-founder, who held independent military or ideological influence over his core fighting base.
So he had to go.
He had to be eliminated to ensure that the Asabiyyah of the Berber army was directed solely at the new dynasty, not at the old revolutionary leadership. The dynasty survived precisely because it consolidated power immediately and ruthlessly.
Once secure in North Africa, with the Kutama military cohesion firmly under centralized control, the Fatimids had their sights set on a much larger prize.
Oh yeah, Egypt and eventually the Eastern Caliphate. The early ambition was clear, though often overreached.
The source material notes initial attempts to push east shortly after consolidation, like the raid on Alexandria in AH 302.
These were mainly probing attacks, testing the defenses of Egypt, which at the time was governed by the relatively stable Ikhshidid regime.
And the sources show that sustained conquest was much harder than a simple raid. The successor, Abu al-Qasim, spent years in multiple unsuccessful efforts to conquer Egypt between AH 322 and 334.
The 12-year period is so important because it demonstrates the severe limits of even a powerful, unified revolutionary army. They struggled relentlessly against a well-defended, established local authority like the Ikhshidids.
So it shows that mere asabiyyah and ideological zeal aren't enough when facing competent administration and strong defensive fortifications.
Exactly. But the Fatimids' biggest threat wasn't external, it was internal.
Right in the middle of this expansionist drive, the fledgling Fatimid state itself nearly collapsed from an internal revolt that sounds absolutely catastrophic. The rebellion led by Abu Yazid.
This was the existential crisis. Abu Yazid, known vividly in the Chronicles as the man with the donkey, an almost biblical prophetic moniker, led a formidable revolt that swept through Ifriqiya between AH 333 and 336.
So unlike the Idrisids, who failed to build a lasting base, the Fatimids had the Kutama, but Abu Yazid tapped into a different kind of Berber resistance.
A massive anti-Fatimid uprising fueled by conservative religious sentiments against the new dynasty's radical claims.
To put this in perspective for you, the listener, imagine this. A revolutionary government, having just fought its way into power, suddenly faces a massive civil war led by an almost messianic figure that captures its primary administrative centers, including the major city of Kairouan.
And it threatens total destruction within a decade of its founding.
Just incredible pressure.
The sources convey the intensity and the near-total loss of control. The dynasty was confined to Mahdia, its fortified coastal capital. The very heart of their state was under siege. This crisis becomes the ultimate Khaldunian test of the dynasty's Asabiyyah.
It's group cohesion and resilience under fire.
Exactly.
So who saved the day and how?
The sources universally credit Caliph al-Mansur Billah with the survival of the dynasty. He managed to reorganize the remaining forces, re-energize the Khatama loyalty, which was wavering, fight back relentlessly, and finally defeat and kill Abu Yazid in AH 336.
So he held it all together.
This victory secured the state just as it seemed utterly doomed, proving al-Mansur Billah's exceptional military and political leadership. This near-collapse event is a potent illustration of Khaldun's core insight. Political stability is always ephemeral.
It depends entirely on the immediate strength and cohesion of the ruling military elite, even if they claim divine, infallible right.
It's just, if military falters, the claim is worthless.
While the West was consuming itself with these cycles of revolution and collapse, the original caliphate in Baghdad, the Abbasid domain, was facing its own set of existential crises.
And these weren't external threats from distant empires. They were massive, highly destructive internal rebellions that originated from within the empire's borders. Movements that fundamentally challenged the social and economic foundations of the state.
Precisely. The sources detail two devastating movements that sapped the Abbasid center of its resources, prestige, and ultimately its ability to govern: the Zanj and the Khoramida.
And these were not minor banditry. They were organized political and military structures.
Let's start with the Zanj. The Zanj rebellion was not a flash in the pan. It was a long, drawn-out civil war that lasted for nearly 15 years.
The sources describe it as an immense, sustained military uprising in the swamps of southern Iraq, starting around 255 AH. It was led by the figure known as Sa'ib al-Zanj, or the Lord of the Zanj.
And what made it so unique was its base, right?
Its base, yeah. It was primarily composed of East African slaves, the Zanj, who were employed in massive numbers on the vast agricultural plantations of southern Iraq, which were crucial to the Caliphate's economy.
So this was not just a political revolt, but a huge social and economic explosion. What made it so difficult for the Abbasids to crush?
Multiple factors. First, the sources document the immense military strength and strategic tenacity of the rebels. They successfully built fortified cities and controlled the vital economic nexus around Basra.
And the terrain itself was a huge factor.
A huge factor. The vast, inhospitable swamps and marshes of southern Iraq provided an ideal defensive environment, completely negating the advantage of the Abbasid cavalry. It required the Abbasids to fight on the Zanjis' terms in grueling and expensive amphibious campaigns.
The cost must have been astronomical.
It was paralyzing. The Caliphate had to pour immense resources, manpower, and financial capital into fighting it for over a decade. The sources note the key military leaders deployed, like Ali bin Aban, who were often tied down in endless sieges.
So this rebellion effectively paralyzed the heartland of the Caliphate.
It was a massive internal hemorrhage, draining resources that should have been spent defending the external frontiers or maintaining domestic infrastructure.
And if the Zanj were a physical and economic hemorrhage, then the Khoramida were a radical ideological cancer eating at the empire's spiritual and political core.
The Khoramida were more than just rebels. They were a highly organized, potent military and ideological threat that emerged out of the Ismaili Shia tradition, yet developed their own radical doctrine. Their discipline and effective military tactics allowed them deep penetration into the Abbasid core regions.
They established a powerful base in eastern Arabia, in Bahrain, and turned it into a hostile state.
Exactly. They weren't just fighting local governors, they were operating at a strategic regional level, capable of disrupting the entire economy of the Near East.
And Khaldun stresses their power to destabilize the region through targeted aggressive action.
He does. The sources specifically cite their actions, noting the frequent disruptive sieges of Damascus and their direct military engagements with the exceeded rulers of Egypt. Their power was such that they forced major powers to reckon with them and often pay protection money to secure the safety of pilgrim routes.
And their ultimate moment of ideological defiance came with the raid on Mecca.
That event, detailed vividly in the Chronicles, showed the full extent of their radicalism and contempt for the existing religious order. In age 317, the Khoramida raided Mecca during the Hajj season, massacred pilgrims, desecrated the holy sites.
And most shockingly, stole the Black Stone.
They removed it to their capital. This single act was a profound shockwave across the entire Muslim world, demonstrating the Abbasid Caliphate's utter inability to protect the faith's most sacred places.
So the Abbasid Caliphate was suffering these twin internal catastrophic blows, but the fatal blow to its political authority came not from the Zanj or the Khoramida, but from its own military administrators.
The very people who were supposed to be defending it. This brings us to the Buyids, or the Buwayhi dynasty.
This is perhaps the most significant political shift we analyze today because it illustrates the concept of central authority dissolving from within.
It's a perfect example. The Buyids, originating from Persia, didn't march on Baghdad to depose the caliph. They marched on Baghdad and seized the administrative and military machinery of the state.
Okay, let's unpack the specifics of this power shift because this is where the symbolic nature of the caliphate really begins.
The Buyids essentially rendered the Abbasid Caliphate symbolic, a phantom government. They controlled the military, the finances, and the actual governance of Iraq and Persia. The key mechanism here was the title they adopted, Amir al-Umara, or Commander of Commanders.
And this title, it was sanctioned by the caliph, but held by the Buyid strongman, giving them total military and civil control.
Total control.
So the caliph was maintained purely for symbolic and religious legitimacy. Why? Why keep him at all? Why not just declare themselves the rulers?
That's the excellent analytical question that Khaldun helps us answer. The Buyids were Twelver Shia, whereas the Abbasids were Sunni. Overthrowing the caliph outright would have instantly alienated the vast Sunni majority of the empire, including the military forces they needed to maintain control.
And it would have risked legitimacy battles with the rising Fatimid Shia caliphate to the west.
Exactly. By keeping the Abbasid caliph alive, albeit powerless, they maintained a necessary figurehead for Sunni powers in the region and neutralized ideological threats to their own rule.
So the Abbasid caliph's continued existence wasn't a sign of his power, but a utility for the Buyids. He was a political shield.
Precisely. A political shield is the perfect way to put it. The person holding the title of caliph lost all real temporal political authority. The title was held hostage by powerful non-Arab military families, first the Buyids and later others.
So Khaldun views this as the ultimate decay of the dynasty's original Asabiyyah.
Completely. The state apparatus was still there, but the group cohesion and loyalty necessary to enforce power had transferred entirely to the military strongmen.
This pattern, the real power residing with the military strongman regardless of his ideological background, leads us perfectly to the next phase. The fight for the most strategic territory in the entire region.
A fight that would redefine the Islamic world, Egypt and Syria.
Egypt was and remains the ultimate prize. Controlling Egypt meant massive agricultural wealth, control over the critical trade routes of the Red Sea, and strategic control over North Africa and the Levant.
It was the linchpin. Before the Fatimid conquest, the Ikhshidid dynasty, exemplified by figures like Muhammad bin Tush, managed to maintain order there, often against immense odds.
Their job sounds utterly impossible, wedged between the revolutionary Fatimids and the radical Khoramida, with the Buyids threatening from the east.
It was a continuous defensive war. The Ikhshidids struggled constantly to maintain control in Egypt and Syria against multiple external threats, primarily the Fatimids from the west, as well as internal rivals like the Hamdanids to the north.
So they were a competent dynasty, but they were just exhausted by perpetual external pressure.
They were worn down. And the defense finally crumbled in age 358. The sources detail the successful Fatimid conquest of Egypt. This wasn't a raid, this was a permanent relocation of power.
This was the culmination of decades of strategic ambition.
Finally executed by the brilliant military commander Jawar al-Sikili, acting under the authority of the Caliph al-Mu'izz li-Din Allah. Jawar's campaign was meticulously planned and executed, utilizing the formidable Kutama armies, now proven in battle, to finally overthrow the weakened Ikhshidid structure.
Jawar al-Sikili's success marks a massive geographical and political shift. This was the moment the revolutionary regime pivoted permanently from their arid North African base to the wealth and political centrality of Egypt.
Not only did they conquer it, but they immediately founded an entirely new capital, Al-Qahira, which is modern-day Cairo, situated strategically on the Nile.
And founding Cairo instantly changed the regional balance of power.
Instantly. The Fatimids were no longer distant North African rebels. They were now a central Mediterranean and Red Sea power, challenging the Abbasids in the east and threatening the Byzantines in the north. They had successfully translated their revolutionary Asabiyyah into an enduring, wealthy state apparatus.
And once they established that stronghold, the focus of geopolitical volatility immediately shifted northward to Syria, particularly the crucial city of Damascus.
Control over Damascus meant control over the gateway between Egypt, the Arabian Peninsula, and Mesopotamia. The sources describe the perpetual conflict around Damascus during this era as a political centrifuge.
That's centrifuge.
It was a battleground, constantly besieged and conquered, cycling rapidly between Fatimid control, Qaramida incursions who occasionally received payment to leave, and local forces battling for supremacy. Control was fleeting. Instability was rampant.
And the Fatimids and their armies, based now in Cairo, were also actively involved further north along the Mediterranean coast. We see significant military confrontations with the Byzantines, referred to as Rum.
And the constant pressure around the holy city of Jerusalem, or Beit al-Maqdis. The control and siege of Jerusalem by Fatimid forces, like those of Jawhar al-Sakili, were highly symbolic acts of religious and political dominance.
Asserting their caliphal claim.
Right. The confrontations with Byzantium, however, were purely pragmatic. The sources mention that sometimes the pressures from the powerful Byzantine Empire would force local Islamic polities, even those who hated each other, into temporary military truces or alliances along the northern frontier.
So the threat from the outside world could briefly stabilize the fractured dynamics of the region.
For a moment, yeah.
Let's fast forward slightly into the 11th century. Even after the massive Fatimid power moved to Cairo, political stability remained profoundly elusive, especially under Caliph al-Mustansir Billah.
This just confirms Khaldun's point that dynastic longevity is inherently limited.
Oh, so?
Al-Mustansir's rule, one of the longest in the dynasty, was paradoxically defined by systemic instability and famine. His caliphate was racked by military mutinies, internal coups, and the rise of powerful non-dynastic figures.
So he was forced to rely heavily on various viziers and military commanders to manage the constant crises.
Men of diverse ethnic backgrounds, too. Berbers, Turks, and Sudanese.
So he was the caliph, but he was constantly managed by his own generals and ministers.
Absolutely. This reliance often on non-dynastic military strongmen who became kingmakers, deposing and installing viziers at will, further demonstrates that by the 11th century, the caliphal title, whether Abbasid in Baghdad or Fatimid in Cairo, was utterly subordinate to the actual fighting forces and the military figures who controlled them.
The age of central personal caliphal power was definitively over.
Replaced by military regencies.
Speaking of powerful fighting forces, while the Fatimids established their rule in Egypt using Berber, Turkish, and Mamluk groups, an entirely new military force was simultaneously reshaping the entire eastern half of the Islamic world.
And confirming the long-term historical trend, the Turkic ascendancy.
This demographic and military shift is arguably the most critical long-term geopolitical consequence of the period Khaldun documents.
No question. The established Arab and Persian dynastic structures were fundamentally undermined by highly effective mobile armies recruited from Turkic groups originating from Central Asia. These groups brought a new type of military power based on cavalry skill and intense tribal loyalty, or Asabiyyah.
Our sources point directly to the Ghaznavids as a primary, successful example of this new military order. We have to discuss Sultan Mahmud of Ghazni, who died around 1030 CE.
Mahmud Ghazni was a colossal figure, transforming a provincial garrison state in modern Afghanistan into a major regional empire, almost entirely through military conquest. He was one of the first figures to adopt the title Sultan, signifying true temporal military control.
So he didn't need the caliph's sanction, really.
Not in the same way. But what's crucial to understand about the Ghaznavid war machine, as detailed in the sources, is where their imperial funding and fame came from, the Indian frontier, or Hindustan.
This is a great example of an extractive state model. How did the Indian expeditions fund the empire?
The sources emphasize the detailed accounts of his military expeditions deep into Hindustan. These campaigns resulted in the seizure of immense wealth, gold, jewels, and slaves, and vast territory. This wealth, extracted from the frontier, funded the imperial structure, the immense standing army of slave soldiers, the Mamluks, and the court culture.
So the Indian frontier was the treasury that allowed Mahmud to maintain the necessary Asabiyyah among his troops and project power.
That was the mechanism. The Ghaznavid Empire was fundamentally a military state sustained by continuous expansion and plunder, not primarily by agriculture or settled trade, like the Fatimid model.
Which means it was inherently unstable. It required constant military success to maintain the inflow of cash and the loyalty of the military elite.
Exactly. And the durability of that structure was immediately tested upon Mahmud's death. This is Khaldun's cyclical pattern in action.
The sources meticulously track the struggles of his successors, Masud and Madud, highlighting that internal conflict and external threats quickly challenged the elaborate structure Mahmud had built.
The internal struggle for succession, fueled by the vast wealth and powerful military factions, led to a rapid decline in the essential group cohesion. While Masud and Madud fought over the throne, the empire's military strength was dissipated, making them vulnerable to newer, hungrier forces.
And the primary external threat that led to this decay was the emergence of the Seljuks, referred to in the sources as the Harkat Turkmen, the Turkmen movement.
This confirmed the fundamental geopolitical truth. One nomadic military power was being replaced by an even newer, fiercer, and more cohesive one. The sources detail the conflicts between the later Ghaznavid rulers and these rising Turkoman tribes, the Seljuks, who were migrating westward.
And the Ghaznavids lost critical battles and territory in Khorasan.
They did.
So the Ghaznavids, who themselves were a non-Arab military power, were defeated by the Seljuks, who were the next generation of Turkic military force. This movement was relentless.
Absolutely relentless. The Turkomans, guided by their own powerful tribal Asabiyyah and highly effective cavalry tactics, began to successfully challenge established powers throughout Khorasan and Persia. This entire era marks the beginning of the great Turkic military-political dominance that would last for centuries.
And the Seljuks would move on to conquer the Buyid territories, take control of the Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad,
And eventually push into Anatolia, forever changing the ethnic and political landscape of the Middle East. They are the ultimate expression of the military elite seizing power from the decaying dynastic core.
This entire deep dive, guided by Ibn-e-Khaldun's rigorous historical framework, presents a remarkable synthesis of political and military collapse and formation. If we step back, what is the core lesson about power from Volume 4?
If we synthesize this chaos, we see that the entire period was defined by two powerful simultaneous forces: the fragmentation of central authority, which gave rise to the symbolic caliphs, and the rise of decentralized but militarily powerful regional states: Idrisids, Fatimids, Ghaznavids, Seljuks.
The source material consistently shows that high political claims, whether they were claims of caliphal authority based on historical tradition or revolutionary Alawite claims based on divine right, often bowed to the immediate reality of boots on the ground and territorial control.
That's the ultimate brutal lesson of this period, and it's the core of Khaldunian philosophy. Legitimacy might be sought in theology or lineage, but stability was measured purely by military control and the maintenance of loyal armies with high Asabiyyah.
Whether those armies were the Kutama Berbers who founded Cairo, the slave soldiers of the Buyids who ruled Baghdad, or the Turkoman cavalry of the Seljuks.
It doesn't matter. Stability was ephemeral, resting entirely on the current strength and cohesion of the ruling military elite. The age of central, unified caliphal power was decisively replaced by the age of the military strongman.
So, what does this all mean for you, the learner, having mapped this medieval chaos? What stands out is not the suddenness of the fall, but the cyclical nature of power loss. It reminds us that massive, seemingly unshakable dynasties fall not from a single dramatic blow to the capital, but from the slow, relentless erosion of peripheral authority starting thousands of miles away.
This raises an important question for you to consider, one that connects this history to the modern world. Khaldun shows us how Baghdad lost control of North Africa, then Persia, then its military, long before the city itself fell. How does understanding this slow peripheral decay, this internal hollowing out of power structures, help us understand the collapse or transformation of massive, seemingly unified structures in modern history?
Whether they are empires, political alliances, or even multinational corporations.
Yeah,
The crack often starts far from the center, where the cost of projecting power becomes greater than the benefit of holding territory. Perfect thought to end on. We've extracted the nuggets, connected the dots, and seen that whether you're facing a Zanj revolt or a Seljuk challenge, the deepest lesson is always that geographic distance and overwhelming military force ultimately dictate the terms of power in history.
Until next time.
Join us for the next deep dive.